When we think of Italian history, the subject of Rome inevitably comes to light. However, at a time when Rome was nothing but a minor city-state ruled by local and even foreign kings, much of central Italy and beyond was dominated by the Etruscans. Organized into numerous city-states themselves, this people managed to build a sophisticated and wealthy society of their own and established commercial, political, and military rule over much of the Apennine Peninsula. This is the history of the Etruscan civilization. The Etruscan culture emerged in the areas of today's Tuscany, Lazio, and Umbria by about 900 BCE. They called themselves the Rasenna, or Rasna. To the Greeks they were known as Turhrenoi, or Tursenoi, and later to the Romans as Tusci, or Etrusci. The earliest author recording the Tersenians was Hesiod in the 8th century BCE. In the Theogony, he mentions them in the context of Odysseus's endeavors in central Italy. Quote, the famous Tursenoi, living very far off in a recess of sacred islands. Another early mention was made in the Homeric hymn to Dionysus, dated to the 7th century, and possibly originating in the time of Homer. There, the Tursenoi are mentioned as pirates, moving swiftly over the dark wine sea. Neither source tells us much about the Etruscan origins, something that was debated by later ancient Greek writers. Historians such as Herodotus and Thucydides, as well as the geographer Strabo, recount a story of Pelasgians migrating to Italy from Asia Minor. According to one version, Turhrenos, or Tyrrhenus, was originally a prince from Lydia who migrated from Asia Minor to the island of Lemnos. There he was joined by the Pelasgians who lived on the island, as well as those of neighboring Imbros. They subsequently sailed west towards Italy, where they settled in an area by the sea. The region thus became known as Tyrrhenia or Etruria, and the sea, the Tyrrhenian Sea. Hellenicus of Lesbos, writing in the 5th century BCE, tells a slightly different version. According to him, there was a migration of Pelasgians from Thessaly to the Italian peninsula. The Pelasgians migrated to an area called Tyrrhenia, which they colonized, and from then on became known as Tyrrhenians. Later historian Dionysius of Halicarnassus, writing in the 1st century BCE, and aware of the above-mentioned theories, openly rejects the alleged Pelasgian origin of the Etruscans. Dionysius asserts that the Etruscans' own name for themselves is Rasenna. He also notes that Xanthus of Lydia, the preeminent historian of the 5th century BCE from Sardis, who wrote extensively about Lydian history, was not aware of any supposed Lydian origin of the Etruscans. Quote, Xanthus of Lydia, who was as well acquainted with ancient history as any man, and who may be regarded as an authority second to none on the history of his own country, yet neither names Tyrrhenus in any part of his history as a prince of the Lydians, nor knows anything of the landing of a colony of Lydians in Italy. Dionysius further says that, quote, Those probably come nearest to the truth who declare that the nation migrated from nowhere else, but was native to the country, since it is found to be a very ancient nation, and to agree with no other, either in its language or in its manner of living. Roman historians, on the other hand, made parallels between the Etruscans and their Alpine neighbours to the north, the Raeti. Titus Livius, or Livy, in his Ab Urbe Condita, written in the 1st century BCE, asserts that the northern Raeti were of Etruscan origin. Quote, "The Alpine tribes have also undoubtedly the same origin as the Tusci, especially the Raeti, who have been rendered so savage by the very nature of the country as to retain nothing of their ancient character save the sound of their speech, and even that is corrupted." Similarly, Gaius Plinius Secundus, or Pliny the Elder, recalls the Etruscan origin of the Raeti. Quote, "Adjoining these, the Alpine Noricans, are the Raeti and the Vindelici. All are divided into a number of states. The Raeti are believed to be a people of Tuscan origin, driven out by the Gauls. Their leader was named Raetus. When it comes to the Etruscans themselves, the Etruscan mythology mentions two brothers, Turhrenos and Tarchon, as the original founders of their civilization. The brothers sought advice from a soothsayer called Tarchies, Latinized as Tages, who was said to be autochthonous to Etruria, spawned from the earth itself. Tages taught divination to the people and established a set of religious laws which formed the so-called Etrusca Disciplina, the Etruscan discipline. Another portion of the rules was believed to have been set up by a nymph named Vicuvia, or Veku. The correct methods for the foundation of shrines and cities, and also for measuring space, dividing time, and many other regulations and conceptions of life, were thereby said to have been introduced. It is by these rules, as prescribed by the gods, that the Etruscans believed their ancestors had built their society. The archaeological evidence, on the other hand, shows the existence of prehistoric cultures stretching all the way back into the Neolithic age. However, the identity of these prehistoric inhabitants is difficult to determine. By the Middle and Late Bronze Age, the Apennine culture, with its local variations, had become dominant in central and southern Italy. People of the Apennine culture were cattle herdsmen who lived in small hamlets located in defensible places. They lived in small communities, sometimes caves and rock shelters, and they built temporary camps during pastures of the summer season. Meanwhile, to the north, the Terra Mare culture spread across the Po River Valley. People of this culture practiced agriculture, cultivating beans, grapes, and wheat. They were also skilled in metallurgy, casting bronze in molds of stone and clay. They also produced bronze weapons, such as axes, daggers, and swords. Their settlements were defensively built, surrounded by earthwork, strengthened on the inside by buttresses, encircled by a wide ditch, and supplied with water. Whether one of these cultures took over, or perhaps influenced the other to evolve, remains a matter of scholarly debate. By the end of the Bronze Age, Italy had descended into what we now know as the Proto-Villanovan culture. The Proto-Villanovan settlements spanned all across Italy. Although the heaviest concentration was in the northern and central regions, such as Veneto, the Po River Valley, and Etruria, Proto-Villanovans were also present in southern Italy and even eastern Sicily. Their settlements were still smaller in size and were typically built on hills with good defensive positions and then fortified with walls. Their economy was mostly based on agricultural and pastoral activities, but also metallurgy and trade. The ethnic and linguistic composition of the Proto-Villanovans, based on their later regionalization, was likely not uniform. This can be seen from the further evolution and development of the Italian regions, where some of them belonged to the Proto-Italic speakers, who were Indo-Europeans, as well as more distantly related Proto-Iapygians to the south, also Indo-European speakers. However, other regions, such as Etruria and Padania, proved to be inhabited by linguistically unrelated pre-Indo-European speakers, the ancestors of the Etruscans. However, for one reason or another, all of these groups still belonged to the same uniform material culture, especially during the early Proto-Villanovan period. Among its notable traits was a practice of cremation, the ashes being placed in funerary urns and then, decorated with geometrical designs, buried in the ground. Over time, certain graves became much more distinguished than others. The prominent ones became separated from the rest and contained jewelry, bronze armor, and horse harnesses, among other things, signifying the development of an influential and powerful hierarchical class, especially in central Italy. By 900 BCE, the Proto-Villanovan culture was fully regionalized and had evolved into several different cultures. Perhaps the most advanced among them was the one arising across Etruria, Padania, and parts of Campania, thus marking the beginning of the Etruscan civilization. The Etruscan civilization was not a single kingdom or a political entity, but rather consisted of numerous independent city-states. A city-state was called a metallum, and they originally existed as monarchies in early times. Etruscan monarchs carried the title of laucame, borrowed into Latin as lucumo, essentially meaning king. Kings originally held vast powers, serving as both the chief magistrate of the state and commander-in-chief of the army. Over time, in some of the cities, although not all of them, the monarchy was eventually abolished and the king, or laucame, replaced by the annually elected chief state magistrate, called tsilat. Unlike king, the position of tsilat was not hereditary. Although one person could be elected tsilat several, and in some cases many, consecutive times. There were apparently also cases where a tsilat assumed kingly or dynastic rule without changing his official title, perhaps similar to a tyrant in the Greek world. In each case, there was also a number of other magistrates who assisted either tsilat or king in the ruling of a city. Although we do not know the exact functions of each magistrate, we do have records of several state offices. Maxtreo, possibly but not certainly the master of the horse, or another similar function to a Roman magister. Maru, a position possibly consisting of religious and or civic duties. Purta, seemingly a high position which could be held together with that of tsilat. Marunk, an office tied to public works, such as the construction and maintenance of roads, buildings, and monuments. Several minor tsilat magistrates also existed, assigned to specific departments within a city. Tsilat eterau, was the magistrate of the youths. Tsilat Spureti, a department connected to a city or urban centre. Silat Skuntnoes, a role which could be connected to building projects. And finally, there are other offices for which the duties are uncertain, such as Kamti, Parnik, and Tamera. Besides the political offices, a highly respected religious college existed. These were the priests known to the Romans as haruspices or sacerdotes. They had the authority to interpret Etrusca disciplina, including all sorts of important omens and divination. According to the inscriptions, several types of priests existed, such as Kapin, Maru, Eisneo, and Hatrenku, an office reserved for priestesses. In the city of Tarchuna, there were 60 priests in the religious college. All of these, both state and religious magistrates, were selected from the Etruscan aristocracy. These were the most powerful Etruscan families which belonged to the aristocratic clans, tracing their lineage to the earliest times. The clans were led by their principes, and had a number of their representatives in the city assembly. This was a body where state officials were elected. Presumably they had to be approved by the king during the monarchic times, a practice which later waned as the office yielded more power. The ordinary citizens had very little say in the decision-making of state affairs. Instead, they worked the land and had a variety of other jobs, such as craftsmen, builders, artisans, merchants, sailors, and so on. Underneath the common people were, of course, slaves, deprived of their freedom or any rights. The Etruscan women enjoyed a relatively high place in society, compared to women in other contemporary cultures. Although unable to be elected for public office, it appears that women did have a legal status and were able to own property in their name and conduct trade. They also kept their family names upon marriage, which were displayed in full on numerous frescoes, tombs, and monuments, alongside those of their husbands. Etruscan women, especially those of the patrician class, were very fashionable and richly dressed, wore elaborate jewelry and makeup, and displayed their wealth and status. They also attended banquets alongside men, something that was considered scandalous by the likes of the Greeks and Romans. Etruscan city-states, although independent of one another, held membership in the Etruscan League, which was known to them as Mech Rasnal, or the League of the Etruscan People. Typically, the Etruscan League consisted of 12 member city-states whose representatives met once per year. The sacred meeting place was Fanum Voltumnae, or the Shrine of Voltumna, a place where religious and possibly political and even military affairs were discussed. The League also elected its magistrate, called Silat Mechel Rasnal, who was chosen for the office for a period of 1 year. His real authority, however, is questionable, as the League did not have the power to force decisions upon its city-states. It is possible that this position was largely ceremonial. However, during turbulent times, the League had the ability to elect a dictator, called Maxtrana or Mastarna. In the case of an existential threat, typically war, a Mastarna would be given enhanced powers and lead a combined military force over a limited period of time. A similar practice would later be famously adopted by the Romans. The original Mech Rasnal, the League of the 12 cities of Etruria, variously consisted of Tarchuna, Weis, Wiesul, Caesara, Welk, Cleusin, Velusna, Vetluna, Felatri, Perusna, Kurtun, and Aritim, and possibly several other cities, such as Fufluna, Rasila, Pisna, and or others, depending on the period. This so-called Dodecapolis of Etruria was accompanied by a league to the north known as Etruria Padana, and another one to the south, Etruria Campana. Etruria Padana revolved around the Po River Valley, bordering Venetian, Rhaetian, Gallic, and Ligurian tribes. Etruscan cities here included settlements such as Felsna, Arimna, Atria, Spina, Mantua, Parma, Carmna, Cainua, Mutina, Misala, Ravenna, and Caesna, among others. To the south was Etruria Campana, with its main city Capua, also known in Latin as Capua. Smaller Campanian metalums variously included Nulla, Pompeii, Ischia, Irnti, Amena, Herclena, Irna, Nucra, Suessula, Caeti, Veltri, and several others. However, many of these settlements were either only briefly held by the Etruscan settlers or established as small trading posts. Some of them served as tributaries to larger cities such as Capua, or were contested with both the Italic tribes and Hellenic colonists from the south. Although each league apparently existed on its own as a rather loose alliance, the Dodecapolis of Etruria was likely the best organized and most influential, not only politically, but also as a cultural area, and home to many sacred centers of the Etruscan religion. Religion was highly important to the Etruscans, so much so that their religious rules and practices came to be highly respected even in the later Roman times. They believed all visible phenomena to be manifestations of divine power, which was embodied in deities who constantly acted on the world and could be either persuaded or dissuaded by mortals. The famed Etrusca Disciplina was a set of rules for the conduct of all sorts of divination, tracing its origins to the legendary autochthonous prophet Tarquinius and the sacred nymph Veku. It was interpreted by the Sacred Priestly College, a highly important office in each Etruscan metalum. The Etruscan religion was polytheistic and heavily influenced by the Greek religion and mythology. Virtually all of the Etruscan pantheon found their equivalents among the pantheon of the Hellenes. The chief god of the Etruscans was Din or Dinia, the ruler of the skies, bearing nearly the same attributes as Zeus. The chief goddess was Uni, the wife of Dinia and equivalent to Greek Hera and Roman Juno. Naturally, she was the goddess of marriage, family, fertility, and women. The third among the most important Etruscan deities was Minerva, the daughter of Dinia and Uni. As an equivalent to Roman Minerva or Minerva and Greek Athena, she was the goddess of wisdom, war, art, and medicine. A great number of other Etruscan gods were similarly either Hellenized or had their Greek equivalents, such as Apollo, the god of sun and health, Laran, the god of war, Aritimi, the huntress goddess and sister of Apollo, also the mistress of animals, Turan or Apru, the goddess of love, Gel, the earth goddess, Turmsh, the god of trade and messenger between gods and humans, Fufluns, the god of wine and happiness, Horta, the goddess of agriculture, Setalans, the god of metalworking. Orcus was a god of the underworld and a punisher of broken oaths. He was originally an equivalent of Greek Horkos, representing a curse inflicted on those who swear a false oath. Over time, Orcus became increasingly similar to Hades in his representation of the underworld itself. Later on, the Etruscans would adopt a proper Hades equivalent, Aita, the ruler of the underworld, together with his wife, Persipnae. Nertuns was a god of springs and water. Unlike his Greek counterpart Poseidon, Nertuns was not among the supreme deities, being possibly of Umbrian origin. As time went by, the Etruscans made him more similar to Poseidon, accompanying him with a trident and 2 dolphins, and making him the ruler of the sea. Another god who did not have the same attributes as his supposed Greek counterpart was Marish, the protector of the spirits of war. Unlike Laran and Ares, and their Roman equivalent Mars, Marish does not appear to be among the main gods, being rather represented as a child and a son of Hercle. Hercle, based on Heracles, was predictably represented as a great muscular hero, carrying his signature club and wearing a lion skin. However, unlike his Greek counterpart, whose father was Zeus and mother was a mortal, both of Heracles' parents were the supreme deities, being Dinia and Uni. While numerous other gods, goddesses, and mythological figures had their equivalents among the Greek Olympians, some of the deities were uniquely Etruscan. Among those were Gata, daughter of the sun, Tecum, god of the ruling class, Cursans, a two-faced god of doors and doorways, similar to Roman Janus, Selwans, god of the woodlands and sacred boundaries, equivalent to Roman Silvanus, Persu, the deity of the mask, and many others. When it comes to the linguistic identity of the Etruscans, they very much differed from all their neighbours in Italy. The Etruscan language was not Indo-European, and thus not related to the Italic languages spoken by the Latins, Umbrians, Oscans, and others. Considered by linguists to be a near isolated language, Etruscan is believed to predate the arrival of Indo-Europeans in Italy, and is thus variously dubbed a Paleo-European or pre-Indo-European language. Etruscan does, however, appear to be related to as many as 2 equally enigmatic, and even less attested, ancient languages. One of these appears to be the Rhetic language of the Eastern Alps, as correctly observed by Roman historians Livy and Pliny the Elder. The other one is believed to be the mysterious Lemnian language, recorded in the 6th century BCE on the island of Lemnos. Whether or not this sheds light on the Pelasgian hypothesis, mentioned by some of the Greek historians, is still difficult to determine with certainty. Based on linguistic similarities, Etruscan, Rhetic, and Lemnian are typically grouped together by linguists into their own Tersinian family of languages. Either way, the Etruscan language was finally written down by the late 8th century BCE after the arrival of Hellenic colonists to Italy. As the Greeks arrived, they founded numerous cities in coast and southern Italy and across the island of Sicily. Those that founded the colony of Cumae especially rose to prominence, being one of the chief colonies of Magna Graecia, and established trade connections with the Etruscan city-states to the north. The Cumaeans brought the Euboean Greek alphabet with them, something that was utilized by the Etruscans to develop their own similar writing system. Many other Italic peoples likewise developed their writings around this time. Perhaps most notably, the Old Latin alphabet was thus derived from Etruscan. Early Etruscan history, as is often the case, is shrouded in myths and legends. In Etruscan tradition, brothers Tarchon and Tyrrhinus are credited with the foundation of the original Mech Rasnau in Etruria. Tarquina was among the oldest and most prominent Methlums. It was said to be founded and named by King Tarchon. Roman mythology makes him a character in a founding myth of the Latins. Later, Byzantine-era writer Ioannis Laurentius Leidus, or John the Lydian, distinguishes two Etruscan kings with this name. First, the original Tarchon, whom he calls Tarchon the Elder, was the legendary founder of the Etruscan cities, and the king who received the famed Etrusca Disciplina from the prophet Tages. This was at a time which predates the Aeneid and the events of Roman mythology. The second Tarchon, or Tarchon the Younger, was his descendant and lived during the time of the Aeneid. There, Virgil tells us that Tarchon and his army aided the prince Aeneas and his Trojans against King Turnus of the Rutili. Then, an ousted Etruscan ruler from Caesarea, Mezentius, takes the opposite side and aids Turnus in war. Ultimately, Aeneas and his allies come out victorious and settle in Latium among the Latins, setting the stage for the foundation of Rome centuries later. Although, in the Aeneid, Mezentius is killed by Aeneas, in an earlier traditional version of the myth, Mezentius in fact survives the war and even outlives Aeneas in the end. These early tales, although in various versions, were used by the Etruscans, as well as their neighbours, to show their ancient and glorious lineage, ultimately deriving from the gods themselves. The Villanovan period, which we consider the early phase of the Etruscan civilization, started at about 900 BCE. By this time, the Italian peninsula was fully regionalized into several different cultures. Besides Tarquina, which is an older Etruscan settlement, and possibly Veii and Caesarea, many Etruscan cities trace their foundation to this period. The settlements were still very small in this phase, and were gradually developing from simple huts into larger dwellings. Villanovan-era Etruscans introduced ironworking in addition to their bronze metallurgy. Trade also started taking off with other Mediterranean cultures. In the Tyrrhenian Sea, trade contacts were developed with the Nuragic civilization of Sardinia. To the north, the Etruscans were connected to the Amber Road, a trade route that brought amber all the way from northern Europe. To the south, and through the Adriatic, the Etruscans made contact with the most sophisticated civilization of Europe, that of the Greeks. This especially became the case when the Hellenes started establishing their first colonies in southern Italy during the 8th century. Among the first colonies established by the Greeks were Pithecusae or Pithecusae and Cumae, founded by the Euboeans from Eretria and Chalcis. These colonists were the first to establish relations with the Etruscans, first with the Campanians, and then with those in Etruria as well. Euboean Greeks were soon followed by colonists from all parts of Greece, who established new city-states all across southern Italy and Sicily. Their land soon became known as Magna Graecia. Besides trade, commerce, and wealth, Greeks also brought with them their writing system, the Hellenic alphabet. It was precisely the Euboean version of this alphabet that the Etruscans were chiefly exposed to. By the late 8th century, the Etruscans had adopted this script and used it to develop their own, the Etruscan alphabet. This marks the end of the Villanovan and the beginning of the Orientalizing period among the Etruscans. It was a time when the Etruscan Metallurgs became greatly influenced by Greek culture. They also accumulated great wealth and advanced their political power across Italy. Tribes such as the Latins, Falisci, and Volsci, among others, were firmly within the Etruscan sphere of influence. This included a small and seemingly insignificant Latin city of Rome. The Latins themselves would soon use the Etruscan alphabet to develop their own, the Latin alphabet, which we still use today. Up until the 7th century, Tarchuna was easily the most powerful Etruscan city. However, increased trade with the Greeks and an abundance of wealth coming in allowed others, such as Caesarea, to rise in prominence as well. Caesarea built multiple ports, the most important of which was Pyrrhic, which allowed them soon to match Tarchuna in power and influence. The wealth they accumulated can be attested through the lavish tombs they erected at the time. The Regalini Galassi tomb, built in the early 7th century, included vast gold buried together with a Caesarean leading family. There is an inscription indicating possession on a decorated Phoenician bowl. It belonged to Lartia Welturus. Whether she was the wife of a king, zealot, or an otherwise powerful Caesarean aristocrat is not known. Although trade with the Hellenes allowed the Etruscans to reach new heights, the Greeks were not the only commercial power in the Western Mediterranean. To the south, another wealthy and powerful mercantile civilization was on the rise: the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians were originally from the Levant in the eastern Mediterranean, from a coastal area known to the Greeks as Phoenicia. In the previous centuries, their colonists had sailed west and established their own colonies on the coasts of North Africa and southern Iberia. The Phoenicians also built trading posts in Sardinia and in western Sicily, which extended their commercial network to the Tyrrhenian Sea and Etruria itself. The Etruscans thus became one of the commercial powers in the Western Mediterranean, alongside the Greeks and Phoenicians. Etruscan hegemony in Italy spanned from the Po River Valley in Padania all the way to Capua in the south. It is said that King Arimnestos, presumably from Armina, was the first non-Greek ruler to dedicate an offering in Olympia. Arimnestos dedicated a throne to Olympic Zeus and bronze horses of Cynisca, tokens of an Olympic victory. In Latium, the Etruscan influence was profound. In Rome itself, ever since its foundation, Etruscan patrician families held significant political power. By the late 7th century, even the Roman kings were replaced by Etruscan monarchs. Following the death of the fourth king of Rome, Ancus Marcius, in 616 BCE, the throne was bestowed upon Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, a nobleman from Tarchuna in Etruria. Tarquinius Priscus was originally appointed by Marcius in his will as the guardian of his underage sons. However, considering that the Roman monarchs were not automatically assumed to be hereditary, but rather had to be confirmed by popular acclaim, Priscus used his position to convince the assembly to declare him the fifth king of Rome. However, he would later be assassinated in 578, in a plot orchestrated by the sons of Ancus Marcius. Immediately upon his assassination, a power struggle ensued in Rome, in which the Etruscan ruling family sought to preserve power. The palace was quickly ordered closed down by the late king's wife, Danaquil. She announced to the Roman public that the king was wounded, but still alive. She also announced that the supposedly wounded king had appointed his son-in-law, Servius Tullius, as regent, until he should recover. This gave the Etruscan dynasty time to consolidate power with Tullius. By the time that Priscus' death was made public, Tullius was presented as the natural successor to the throne. The Etruscan dynasty in Rome was preserved. Details of these events, as told by the Roman tradition, are not easily historically verifiable. Historical evidence concerning two individuals from Etruria paints perhaps a mildly different picture. It is to this time that we trace some of the most prominent historical figures from the city of Welc, or Wulci. Brothers Caele and Avile Vipina, in Latin known as Caelius and Aulus Vibenna, were highly respected by both the Etruscans and later by Roman historians and statesmen. Although it is unknown which exact positions the brothers occupied in Welc, or possibly the Etruscan League, it is evident that they were in charge of an army involved in a conflict in Etruria, which also included Rome. Their historicity is also confirmed by archaeology. This includes ceramic ware fragments dated to the second quarter of the 6th century BCE with the inscription, Avile Vipina dedicated me. The famed cup was found in a prestigious sanctuary in Wace, thought to be dedicated by Avile himself during the conflict. It is said that the brothers commanded an army, aided by their companions Mastarna, Larth Tulumnes, Rasce, and Marce Camitonas. Roman writers, including later Emperor Claudius, claimed that Mastarna was the Etruscan name of Servius Tullius. The opposing side reportedly included Laris Papa Tanas Welsnak from Welsna, Pesna Arcum Snas Sveamak from Sveama, Cnewe Tarquinius Rumac from Rome, and Ventical Psalcus. It seems that the Vipina brothers, along with Camitonas and Rasce, were at some point defeated and imprisoned in a camp by their enemies. Then Larth Tulumnes was able to break into the camp with his companions and free the Etruscan leaders, who then proceeded to kill their adversaries. Notably, the name Cnewe Tarquinius Rumac in Etruscan could be translated to Gnaeus Tarquinius of Rome in Latin. It is speculated that Gnaeus Tarquinius could in fact be Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, the king of Rome, and that this historical conflict is what actually resulted in the death of Priscus and the rise of Servius Tullius as the new king in Rome. Roman historian Fabius Pictor, in his Lost Works, alludes to the eventual murder of Avile Vipina by a slave of his brother. It is unknown whether this is connected to Servius Tullius, whom the Roman writers variously considered to be a former slave. Either way, the Romans certainly held the Vipina brothers in high regard. One of the famed 7 hills in Rome, the Querquetulan Hill, was thus renamed to Caelian Hill, after Caele Vipina. As the Western Mediterranean trade network expanded, so did the wealth of its main actors, the Etruscans, Greeks, and Phoenicians. However, with increased wealth and power on the line, so increased their mutual rivalry and battle for the commercial routes. Inevitably, this would lead to direct military conflict. So far, the Phoenicians had maintained control over the Iberian trade routes, which went through coastal Gaul and Liguria and reached the Etruscan city-states. This all changed by the year 600, when Greek colonists from Phocea sailed from Asia Minor and founded the city of Massalia on the coast of Gaul. The Phoenicians, having previously resisted Hellenic trade posts in Iberia, were unable to prevent the Phoceans this time. The chief among the Phoenician powers, the city of Carthage, rose as the main Phoenician defender against Hellenic expansion, and started carving out its own commercial empire. The route through Gaul was now disturbed, and Massalia had emerged as a powerful polity of its own. The Etruscans also did not appreciate Greek expansion in the area. The city of Capua, previously the dominant force in southern Italy, had had its influence reduced owing to the Greek colonies in Magna Graecia, especially the city of Cumae. When the Greeks decided to found yet another colony, this time in Corsica in 562, that meant war. The Hellenic colony in Corsica was called Eulalia, and was also founded by Ionian Greeks from Phocea. When their homeland in Asia Minor fell under the Persian Empire, even more Phoceans arrived in the area. It was plausible that the Greeks, if not stopped, could just continue expanding until they reached hegemony, as they had already done in Magna Graecia. For both Etruscans and Carthaginians, this was unacceptable. The two powers thus forged an alliance to confront the Greeks militarily. The conflict culminated in about 540, when a combined Etruscan-Carthaginian fleet attacked the Hellenes at the Battle of Eulalia. The Greek fleet reportedly consisted of 60 Pentaconta ships. The Allied fleet was twice that size, 120 galleys strong. The battle was reportedly fierce, with heavy losses on both sides. Ultimately, the Greeks managed to fight off the invaders. However, they lost almost 2/3 of their navy. Many of their surviving ships were damaged and had to be repaired. The Etruscans and Carthaginians would surely be back. They still had a larger fleet and more resources to sustain a prolonged conflict. Eventually, the Hellenes made a decision. They would evacuate the settlement and resettle in Magna Graecia. Soon afterwards, Eulalia was settled by colonists from Etruria. With the acquisition of Corsica, the Etruscans had reached the height of their expansion. However, their hostilities with the Greeks were far from over. Meanwhile, in Rome, the power struggle between different Etruscan factions continued. In 534, King Servius Tullius was assassinated. His demise came at the hands of Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, the grandson of Tarquinius Priscus. He earned his cognomen Superbus, meaning proud or arrogant, through his ruthless rise to power. He first assassinated his elder brother, Aruns Tarquinius, and then King Servius Tullius himself. Tarquinius then proclaimed himself the 7th king of Rome. He did not consult the Senate. In fact, the new king had several leading senators killed on account of their loyalty to Tullius. The Senate and other institutions were greatly reduced in authority, leaving absolute power in the hands of Tarquinius. These atrocious acts gave way to anti-monarchical sentiment among the Romans, who would soon enough seal the fate of the Roman monarchy. In southern Italy, Campanian Etruscans became increasingly at odds with the expanding Hellenes. This was especially the case with Cumae, which continued the expansion of its sphere of influence at the expense of Capua. Capuan Etruscans sought allies in other Italian peoples who were also unhappy about the situation. An alliance was made between the Etruscans, Umbrians, and Dornians, and included other vassals and mercenaries. A seemingly overwhelming force was raised under the Capuan leadership and sent out to invade Cumae in 524 BCE. Dionysius of Halicarnassus estimates 500,000 infantry and 18,000 cavalry for the invading force. Modern scholars put that number at 50,000 infantry and 1,800 cavalry, still an overwhelming strength. However, the Cumaean Greeks appointed Aristodemus as their strategos, who would prove an exceptional military commander. The Hellenic army numbered between 12,000 and 13,500 infantry and 1,800 horsemen. It is almost certain that these numbers included other Hellenic allies and mercenaries, since Cumae was too small to gather even that size of a force by itself. Aristodemus split his forces into 3 parts and marched out to cover a narrow passage between mountains and swamps. As the Etruscan alliance entered the passage, they attempted to outflank the Greek phalanx with cavalry, but there was not enough space to do so. The Cumaeans marched forward and slashed right into the retreating and disorganized enemy. The Etruscan army was annihilated, and Aristodemus was covered in glory. After the Battle of Cumae, the Etruscan aspirations in southern Italy were put to a halt. The expansion of Hellenic influence in Magna Graecia was bound to continue. Back in Rome, in 509, Tarquinius' ruthless reign was about to end. Lucius Tarquinius Superbus was overthrown in a popular uprising, resulting in the establishment of the Roman Republic. The end of monarchy in Rome also meant the end of the Etruscan Dynasty that had ruled the city for over a century. The deposed king, however, was not to let go of the throne so easily. He applied to the city of his ancestors, Tarchuna, for assistance. The Tarquinians, along with the city of Wace, agreed to reinforce Tarquinius' troops. However, when he attempted to take Rome, he was met with heavy resistance. His army was held to inconclusive battle, with high casualties on both sides. The Romans were done with kings. Tarquinius, on the other hand, was not done. The very next year, he secured help from Larth Tulumnes, the ruler of Cleusine. Tulumnes was an opportunist, and an easy defeat of exhausted Rome seemed like a perfect way of elevating himself. The Cleusian armies soon laid siege to Rome. However, it was also to no success. He quickly realized that Rome was not willing to surrender under any circumstances. Tulumnes thus made peace with Rome and ordered Tarquinius to leave his exile in Cleusine and go somewhere else. On the other hand, Tulumnes also wanted to save face so that his expedition would not be dubbed a failure. He turned his sights to the nearby Latin city of Aricia, wishing for at least some kind of military gain. The Aricians immediately applied for help to the Latin League, a local tribal confederacy of the Latins. They also sent envoys to Cumae in the south. The Greeks responded, sending out an army under none other than Aristodemus. The Battle of Aricia took place in 504. Although the Arician force was initially routed by the Clusians, the arrival of Aristodemus changed the tide of battle. His Cumaean troops reportedly broke the Clusian army from the rear and completely destroyed the Etruscan force. Larth Tulumnes thus went home in defeat. He apparently continued his reign in Kleocene until his death. His tomb was reportedly a monumental structure built around 500 BCE. Elsewhere in Etruria, Caesarea, Tarchuna, and Veii remained the foremost powers in the region. In Caesarea, Silat Tefaria Velianas held office at the turn of the century. Tarquinius, on the other hand, would eventually attempt to capture Rome for the final time, now allied with the Latins themselves. Octavius Mamilius, the dictator of nearby Tusculum, agreed to aid the former Roman king, and the Latin force clashed with the Romans in 496 at the Battle of Lake Regillus. Ultimately, the Romans prevailed, and the defeated Tarquinius was forced to flee both Latium and Etruria altogether. He was eventually granted refuge at the court of none other than Aristodemus in Cumae. From this point on, Rome definitely asserted its independence and broke away from monarchy once and for all. The Etruscan hold over Latium was now shaken. That being said, in Rome, although the Etruscan monarchy was gone, there were still many Etruscan aristocratic families that were among the most powerful in the city, especially during the early Republican period. Gens Tarquitia, presumably a clan that originated from Tarquinius, continued to exist in Rome as a patrician family. There was also a plebeian, gens Tarquinia, either a lower status branch of the same family, or a different clan that also traced its origins to the monarchs of Rome. Other, perhaps now even more influential, Etruscan patrician clans were gens Herminia, Lartia, Verginia, and Volumnia. Many of these families actually opposed monarchy during the war against Tarquinius and were among the leading republican forces. Gens Herminia, for example, had Titus Herminius Aquilinus elected Roman consul in 506 during the war. He shared consulship with Spurius Lartius from gens Lartia, who was elected consul once again in 490. Spurius's brother, Titus Lartius, was a consul in 501, the same year he was elected the first dictator in the history of the Roman Republic. He then served as consul once again in 498. Gens Verginia also had a consul during these years, with Opiter Verginius Tricostus, elected in 502. However, all of these originally Etruscan families held loyalty not to any metalum of the Etruscan League, but to their own city, which was Rome. Besides, the majority of both patrician and plebeian families in the city were Latins. Rome was independent, and some in Etruria did not like it. One of those cities was Veii, which had started building tensions with Rome ever since the monarchy was overthrown. Veii was the closest Etruscan neighbor of Rome, and any independent action by the Romans was noticed by the Veientes. There are no great details on whether border disputes, skirmishes, or other events caused such hostility between Veii and Rome. Either way, their conflict had acquired a military character. As soon as the Veientes had secured support from other Etruscan troops, they went to war and met the Romans on the field of battle. In the ensuing Battle of Cremera, the Veientine army was victorious. the defeated Romans being forced to flee for their lives. The Veientes now decided to march on Rome itself. As they did so, however, they were forced to constantly engage in minor battles and skirmishes with the Roman defenders. The two sides fought yet another battle the same year, the army of Veii once again defeating the Roman force. The Romans persisted. They did not want to be back under the Etruscan yoke. Several minor battles once again followed, and the Veientes were unable to mount a successful siege on Rome. The war would drag on for years. In 476, the two sides had several more battles, which were hard-fought and inconclusive. The Veientes then first withdrew to the Roman countryside, which they pillaged, before finally realizing that they would not be able to take the city itself. Ultimately, the decision was made to abandon the campaign altogether. The very next year, in 475, Veii formed an alliance with the neighboring Sabines. Both sides were opposed to any Roman influence within Latium, and likely planned to divide the region into their own spheres of influence. The Romans were themselves supported by their Latin allies, as well as the tribe of Hernici. The combined Latin army decided to surprise the Veientes, and marched into the territory of Veii for battle. The battle took place in the same year, and this time Veii was defeated. In 474, the Veientes finally sued for peace. Not only did it appear that the Etruscans were losing their grip over Latium, but also that Rome was rising among the Latin city-states. In Campania, the Etruscans had similar issues. The reduced influence of Capua was a direct consequence of the defeat inflicted by Cumae in 524. It showed that the Greek hoplites were the premier land force of the day. The Etruscans still dreamed of replicating the war over Eulalia from the previous century. The difference between Eulalia in 540 and Cumae in 524 was that Eulalia was a naval battle. Perhaps the Greeks were difficult to defeat on land, but there was a history of Etruscan success at sea. The way to defeat Cumae was with ships. Capua, together with its allies, raised a large fleet, determined to finally break the power of Cumae. The Cumaeans were likely significantly outnumbered, and judged their situation as very unfavorable. They applied to Syracuse for help. Syracuse was ruled by the tyrant Hieron I, who had worked on establishing his own city-state as a regional power. He had already built his sphere of influence over western Sicily, and was happy to answer the call of fellow Greeks in Campania. In 474, off the shores of Cumae, the Etruscan fleet was met by the combined Hellenic naval force, led by Hieron of Syracuse. The result was a crushing defeat of the Etruscans. Hieron I was victorious. The Campanian Etruscan fleet was no more. Hieron then dedicated a bronze Etruscan helmet at Olympia, with an inscription commemorating his victory. This defeat broke the Capuan influence in Campania and started a heavy Etruscan decline in the region. While Capua still remained an important Etruscan city for a time, it would later fall under the Samnite yoke, while the Hellenes were free to expand their dominance over much of southern Italy. In central Italy, the decades after the Veientine defeat saw the gradual rise of Rome in Latium. The vacuum was filled by the power struggles between the Romans and their neighbors, such as the Volsci, Sabini, and Aequi. While the Veientes were licking their wounds, other Etruscan powers, such as Tarchuna and Caesarea, did not seem to concern themselves with what was happening in Latium. In Tarchuna, the famed tomb of Orcus was constructed by the Murena family in the first half of the century, at some time between 470 and 450. The Murenas were possibly an offshoot of the powerful gens Spurinna, which influenced Tarquinian politics for centuries. The tomb was reportedly erected during the stewardship of Larth Tulumnes and Marke Galiate. Whether they both held the office during the same year remains unclear. Meanwhile, in Latium, Rome was able to consolidate its gains. Several members of prominent Etruscan families held high offices during these decades. Publius Volumnius Gallus of gens Volumnia was elected consul in 461. 3 years later, during the war against the Aequi and Sabini, Lucius Quintius Cincinnatus was appointed dictator, and his second-in-command, or magister equitum, was Lucius Tarquinius Flaccus of gens Tarquitia. In 448, Lars Herminius Aquilinus of gens Herminia was also elected consul. During all this time, little by little, Rome was on the rise, much to the contemptuous eye of the Veientes. Roman tradition records that a king of Veii, from the middle of the century, named Larth Tulumnes, sought to contain this rise of Rome at any cost. Tulumnes was determined to establish his own hold over Latium, something that previous leaders of Veii had failed to achieve. Tulumnes instigated an anti-Roman revolt in Fidenae, a frontier town formerly under Veii, which had now come under Roman sway. The Fidenates answered the call, and thus allied themselves with Veii, giving Tulumnes command of their army. When Rome sent ambassadors to Fidenae to protest in 438, they were promptly put to death. War then broke out, and by next year the armies were facing off at the Battle of the Aniol River. Although the Roman tradition reports victory, Rome suffered heavy casualties. In fact, they were so high that a state of emergency was declared, Mamercus Aemilius Mamercinus being named dictator by the Roman Senate. Mamercinus then marched to a fortified position by the confluence of the Anio and the Tiber rivers. Tulumnes moved back to the northern shore of the Anio and took a defensive position on the hill between the river and the walls of Fidenae. He then received Faliscian reinforcements from the city of Falerii. The king originally intended to force the Romans to make the first move, but pressured by the Faliscians, he sallied out to face the Romans on the field of battle. The battle was grueling and hard for both sides, the outcome being uncertain. At one point, the Roman cavalry broke through the Etruscan formation. Tulumnes, heading the Etruscan cavalry, came to aid, resulting in a bloody affair with casualties on both sides. The breakthrough came when one of the Roman military tribunes charged at Tulumnes, threw him off his horse, and then fatally stabbed him several times. With Larth Tulumnes' death, the Etruscans withdrew, and the battle was finally concluded. Veii being out of the picture, the Romans proceeded to win the war, Quintus Servilius Priscus capturing Fidenae in 435. The Veientine animosity towards Rome continued. Veii could simply never reconcile with the Roman expansion at their expense. In the following decades, they worked on building an anti-Roman alliance, together with Falerii and Carpna. It is unclear if Veii had attempted to secure assistance from some of the stronger Etruscan cities. Tarquina, for example, was allied with Athens between 415 and 413 during the Sicilian Expedition phase of the Peloponnesian War. The leading Tarquinian family at the time, Gens Spurinna, reportedly held the office of Tsilat during the Sicilian conflict. Athens was determined to defeat Sparta's Sicilian allies, which were led by Syracuse, in an attempt both to cut off any potential Syracusan aid to Sparta and possibly to expand its own empire into Magna Graecia. When the Athenians requested Etruscan assistance, a small Tarquinian force, apparently under Veltur Spurinna, was dispatched to help. Although the Athenians ultimately faced disaster in the Sicilian campaign, the Etruscans fought bravely, a fact which was recognized even by the Greeks. The Spurinna family members would continue to honor their involvement in the Sicilian expedition for centuries. The Tarquinians, however, did not seem to involve themselves at all in the struggle between Veii and Rome. The Veientines were seemingly isolated by most of the Etruscan cities, owing to the preservation of their monarchy. With their new alliance set up and pointed against Rome, the Veientes seemed ready for another war, and after several years of tensions and skirmishes, the Roman-Veientine War broke out in 406. In the words of Plutarch, Veii had been the capital of Etruria, not inferior to Rome, either in number of arms or multitude of soldiers, so that, relying on her wealth and luxury, and priding herself upon her refinement and sumptuousness, she had engaged in many honorable contests with the Romans for glory and empire. This time, the Romans went on the offensive, but the well-fortified Veientines were able to resist. In addition to this, Veii was aided by its allies from Capna, as well as the tribe of Falisci. This dragged the war on for years, and made it a very grueling affair for both sides, especially for Rome. During this conflict, it appears that the Veientes did not enjoy much support within the Etruscan League. Most of the Etruscans looked unfavorably at the fact that Veii was still a monarchy. On top of that, the king of Veii had attempted to force his will in nominations for the Etruscan priesthood. His efforts were ultimately defeated, resulting in the Veientine withdrawal of the actors they had sponsored for the communal games, which was a part of the process. Nevertheless, Veii focused on its war with Rome, and after a series of Veientine advances, the Romans appointed Marcus Furius Camillus as dictator in 396, who was determined to put an end to Veii once and for all. After defeating the Veientine allies, Camillus conducted one final siege on Veii, in which the Romans dug a hole underneath its walls, infiltrated its sewage system, and finally entered the city. The Romans slaughtered the entire male population. All the women and children of Veii were sold into slavery. One of the foremost cities of Etruria thus fell to the Romans, now becoming better known by the Latin version of its name, Veii. The rest of the Etruscan city-states apparently did nothing. Perhaps they saw this as a punishment for the Veientine monarch's insult against the religious proceedings of the Etruscan League. Caesar, for example, even seemed sympathetic to Rome, with whom they maintained friendly relations. Perhaps the destruction of a chief neighboring rival did not sound too bad to the Caesarian ears. On the other hand, such an unprecedented move by the Romans was duly noted, especially in Tarquina. Unfortunately for the Etruscans, they would soon have a much bigger and more imminent threat to be preoccupied about. At the beginning of the 4th century, a new danger appeared, coming from the north of Italy. The Gauls and their many tribes had set their sights southwards. an imminent danger to the Badanian Etruria of the Po River Valley. By 390, the whole region was rapidly overrun, the Etruscans suddenly losing all of Padania to the Gallic invaders. There was very little they could do about it. One of the main Etruscan cities in the area, Felsina, was soundly defeated and taken by the Gauls, and it became the capital of the Gallic tribe of Boii. The city thus became known as Bononia. Not only that, but the Gauls were set to proceed even further, particularly under the leadership of the Senones tribe and their chieftain, Brennus. He soon invaded through Etruria proper, proceeding towards Cleocene. It was at this point that even the Romans realized the great danger of the invasion, and sought to assist the Etruscan city. As a result of this, the Gauls turned their attention to Rome itself. And around 390, the two sides met at the Battle of the Allia. It was here that Brennus, the Gallic warlord, carved his name into the dark pages of Roman history, as his army destroyed the Roman force and subsequently sacked the city of Rome. While the remaining Romans retreated to Veii and rallied behind Camillus to liberate their city, the Etruscans, led by Tarquina, allied themselves with the Volsci and the Aequi. A notable exception to this was the city of Caesarea, which provided aid and shelter to the Romans, who were ultimately able to recapture Rome and defeat the invaders. In 389, fresh armies were raised by the newfound Etruscan, Volscian, Aequian alliance, which intended to strike a fatal blow to the now restored but still vulnerable city of Rome. To counter this, the Romans dispatched one army to meet the advancing Etruscans, while another force, under Camillus, was sent to deal with the Volsci and the Aequi. While Camillus was successful in his campaign, the Etruscan army managed to defeat its Roman contingent and captured the border city of Sutrio. As the Etruscans were looting the city, however, the army under Camillus arrived. They stormed Sutrio itself, devastated the unprepared Etruscan army, and installed their own garrison there. According to Titus Livius, the Romans proceeded in 388 to raid the territory of Tarquina, either capturing or destroying the border settlements of Cortuosa and Contenebra. The next year, in 387, the Etruscan army was dispatched for another showdown. The Romans called for Camillus yet again, but he was soon distracted with the invasion of the Volsci, rendering the Romans unable to stop the Etruscan advance. The Etruscan force promptly moved against Nepete and Sutrio, capturing the former and invading the latter. Although they did manage to enter the city of Sutrio, they failed to completely capture it, battling the defenders street by street. The Etruscan lack of fortune when it comes to Sutrio struck back once again, and yet again it was Camillus who arrived with a Roman army at the last moment, fighting off the Etruscans and retaking the city. The Roman army then marched to Nepete, from whence the Etruscans were once again forced to withdraw. There, too, another Roman garrison was installed. The war thus essentially ended with a status quo ante bellum, neither side being able to gain the advantage. Caesarea, still a Roman ally, apparently did not take sides in this conflict. However, that would still not spare them a misfortune of their own. In 386, Dionysius I of Syracuse was in need of funds for his war against Carthage. With his fleet approaching the coasts of Etruria, he ordered action against the Caesarean port of Pyrrhic. It is unknown whether the Syracusans were already in some kind of conflict with the Etruscans, or if they were perhaps using the opportunity to punish the Etruscans for their part in the Sicilian Expedition. Dionysius' official pretext was the suppression of pirates. And so his fleet landed at Pyrrhic. The Syracusans quickly destroyed the Caesarean garrison and headed towards the rich temple. Caesar dispatched an army to defend the port, but the Syracusans were nevertheless victorious, beating back the Caesarean army, pillaging the temple, and bringing the loot back to Syracuse. The Caesareans had no real means to respond, in addition to their having to navigate the conflict between Tarquina and Rome. Towards the middle of the century, Tarquina was clearly the main power player in Etruria. And among patrician families in the city, gens Spurinna continued to stand in the foremost rank. Its main figure was Avile, known in Latin as Aulus Spurinna, either a son or grandson of the famed Veltur Spurinna. He was elected Silat of Tarquina, most likely multiple times, and had the Tarquinian army under his command. Spurinna was determined to strengthen the Tarquinian hold over Etruria, and even over Latium. His first intervention was in Caesarea, which had long been allied to Rome, and had so far refused to participate in any Etruscan military campaign. There a ruler named Orgonlius was in power, and reigned either as a tyrant or a king. Spurinna's intervention drove out Orgonlius, and installed a pro-Tarquinian government in his stead. What was once Tarquina's equal and a loyal Roman ally was now firmly under the Tarquinian grip. Spurinna's next move was directed towards the northeast. There, the city of Aretim, a longtime member of the Etruscan League, was facing internal struggles. A major slave revolt had broken out, and the Orician government had failed to put it down. The city itself was threatened by an apparent army of slaves. A perfect opportunity for Avile Spurinna to build himself as a guarantor of stability, while also bringing Aretim under his sway. The Tarquinian force thus marched to Aretim and crushed the slave rebellion. It seemed that the whole of Etruria was now united under the Tarquinian banner. Whether Avile Spurinna was elected Silat Mekal Rasnau, or even Mastarna at some point, remains unclear. His military expeditions all over Etruria would indicate at least one of these positions. Either way, relations with Rome remained tense. Rome had lost an important Etruscan ally to Tarquina, and the Tarquinians were gearing for war. Hostilities finally resumed in 358. Tarquina made an alliance with the Falisci, who had held a grudge against Rome ever since the fall of Wace. In turn, a Roman army was assigned to Consul Gaius Fabius Ambustus, who then marched out to meet the Etruscans. The Tarquinian force was, seemingly, still commanded by Avile Spurinna. This is indicated by an Imperial Roman-era inscription attributing to him a successful military campaign in Latium. The Tarquinians proved to be more than a match for the Roman consular army. The battle ended in a decisive victory for Tarquina. Many Romans were taken as prisoners of war and executed. Avile Spurinna reportedly captured 9 Latin strongholds. This likely included the border settlements where Roman garrisons were installed, and possibly several Latin towns which were under Rome. Whether Spurinna continued to be the Etruscan leader after this point is unclear. The office of Silat was elected for only 1 year, and head of the Etruscan League was also for a limited time period. Either way, by 356, another Roman army was raised, this time under Gaius's brother, Marcus Fabius Ambustus. The two sides met again, the Etruscans gaining the initial advantage. The leadership of Marcus, however, proved crucial to the Romans, who were ultimately able to force the Tarquinians to withdraw and abandon their camp. At this time it became apparent that the war was entering another stalemate. Something had to be done. The Tarquinians, for their part, dispatched delegates across Etruria, who were tasked with securing reinforcements. The Tarquinians now received fresh troops from all over Etruria, including the former Roman ally, Caesar. The combined Etruscan army now marched into the Roman territory, their initial target being the Roman salt works. Salt was an extremely valuable mineral at the time, being held in such high regard that the Roman soldiers were sometimes paid in salt rather than in gold, and its production was normally guarded by the military. The Etruscan incursion was successful, which prompted the Romans to appoint Gaius Marcius Rutilus dictator. Rutilus crossed the river Tiber, and while the Etruscans were encamping for the upcoming battle, he conducted a sudden attack. The Etruscans were caught by surprise and routed. It is said that Rutilus took prisoner 8,000 Etruscans, while others were either killed or forced to withdraw back to Etruria. The extent of this victory may have been greatly exaggerated by the Romans, as throughout the following year, 355, both sides reportedly raided each other's territory without a decisive outcome. A major battle, however, would be fought in 354, when the two sides finally met again on the field. The Roman army emerged victorious, but Tarquinians were forced to abandon the campaign. Most of the captured Tarquinian soldiers were massacred. 358 of them, who were nobles, were sent to Rome as prisoners. According to Diodorus, 260 of these were put to death in the Roman Forum. The Tarquinian army being defeated and having withdrawn, the Romans now turned their attention to the Tarquinian allies, primarily Caesar and Falerii. The Caesarians were quick to sue for peace, which was granted to them in 353. The Roman army then invaded the territories of Tarquina and Falerii. The Romans ravaged both, but were seemingly unable to deal the deciding blow to the Tarquinians. Attrition was high on both sides, and casualties continued to mount. In 351, Tarquinian and Falerian envoys met with the Romans, and a truce was agreed for a period of 40 years. This marked the end of Etruscan-Roman hostilities, at least for the moment. In the following years and decades, the cities of the Etruscan League enjoyed a period of relative peace. The city of Cleosin seems to have been among the more prominent metlooms. The Golini tomb inscription from Weltsna from the 4th century BCE records Vel Lecates rising through the ranks to become the Tsilat in Cleosin. His title is recorded as Mechlum Rasneos Cleosin Sult Silaknoe, meaning Tsilat Mechel Rasnul of Cleosin. Now, there is a scholarly debate whether this means that he was a Tsilat of the Etruscan League that came from Cleosin, or whether he was merely a Tsilat in Cleosin. The fact that this inscription is from Weltsna indicates that he might have been elected Tsilat Mechel Rasnul, or at the very least that Weltsna was within the influence of Cleosin. In Tarquina, we record Tsilatship of another member of the Hulknir family. Wel Hulknir, presumably a descendant of Larth Tulumnes, was elected Tsilat during the construction of the so-called Tomb of the Shields. This tomb was constructed in the 3rd quarter of the century by another powerful, long-standing patrician family in Tarquina, gens Welca. The founder of the tomb was Larth, together with his wife Velia Seititi. Also depicted on the frescoes, the father of Larth, Weltor, and his wife Rawentu Arpathnai. In neighboring Kaisra, there were no longer kings, but rather elected officials. The later part of the century records Larth Nulate, elected Silat in the city. While Etruria enjoyed a period of peace and was recovering from wars and battles, Rome did not stay idle. In Campania, the Etruscans were struggling for their independence. Once powerful Capua had never fully recovered from the devastating defeats of the previous century. The neighboring Italic tribes had used this opportunity to further their power, and Capua was placed under Samnite vassalage. The Campanian Etruscans applied to Rome for help. In 343, the Romans obliged and entered the region, thus triggering the First Samnite War. The conflict lasted for about 2 years, the Romans successfully helping Capua regain its independence, but seemingly failing to inflict any decisive defeat on the Samnites. The hostilities thus ended in 341, with no further territorial changes. In the meantime, resentment against Rome in Latium was growing. The Latins, unhappy with the Roman hegemony over the region, decided to break away. In 340, the Roman Republic entered another war, this time against the Latin League. Struggle for control over Latium lasted 2 years. Inevitably, Rome triumphed in 338 and saw significant expansion of its territories. Also establishing a land connection with Capua, the newest Roman ally. The establishment of Roman colonies in Campania over the next decades would anger not only the Samnites, but also the Greeks, who were the dominant power in southern Italy. After several skirmishes, in 327, the Romans entered into war against the Greek city of Neapolis, and a year later against the Samnites. While the Neapolitans quickly switched sides and allied themselves with the Romans, the war against the Samnites, known as the Second Samnite War, would drag on for decades. Back in Etruria, this was viewed as an opportunity which could be used against Rome. The Etruscans were not happy to see Rome further its influence to the south, and thus change the balance of power in Italy. If the Romans were getting overextended, an opportunity to defeat them, and eventually put Latium back under the Etruscan yoke, should not be missed. As the Second Samnite War was coming to a close, just before the 40-year Etruscan-Roman truce was set to expire, the Etruscan League started mobilizing its armies. In 311, the Etruscan force started marching towards the frontier, forcing the Romans to divide their own forces. One, under Gaius Iunius Bubulcus, which continued the war with the Samnites, and another, under Quintus Aemilius Barbula, which moved to meet the Etruscan army. As the Etruscans besieged Sultrium, Aemilius arrived with his forces, and the two sides engaged in a long and grueling battle. As daylight ended, there was no winner on the horizon. The two armies returned to their respective camps. As the stalemate continued, in 310, the new Roman consul, Quintus Fabius Maximus Rullianus, went to Sultrium with reinforcements. After another exhausting battle, the Romans were able to push the Etruscans back. However, upon ravaging the nearby area, Rullianus learned that the Etruscans were actually coming with reinforcements of their own, and that they now outnumbered the Romans. The Etruscan army marched on Sultrium once again, only to have a long standoff with the Romans, who refused to engage. Finally, at dawn, the Romans sallied out of their camp and attacked the Etruscans with full power. The Etruscan army was, apparently, not yet ready for battle, which caused widespread disarray. Many of them fleeing back to the camp. Others ran for the hills and into the forest. After this defeat, the Etruscan unity started breaking up once again. The cities of Perusna, Curtun, and Aritim sued for peace with Rome. The war, however, was not yet over. The Samnites now decided to march to Etruria, determined not to allow Rome to achieve victory. In response, the Roman army marched to Longula, a Volscian town near the border, where the two armies engaged in a standoff. Meanwhile, those Etruscan cities which had not sued for peace continued their war effort and met the Roman army at Lake Vadimo. The Etruscan soldiers invoked the so-called Lex Sacrata, a religious bond whereby they pledged to fight to the death. The two armies thus engaged in yet another grueling affair, with heavy casualties on both sides, each of them having to call up their reserves. Finally, the Roman cavalry was forced to dismount and form another line of infantry. They ultimately broke the Etruscan line and ensured a hard-fought but decisive victory for the Romans. According to Titus Livius, that day broke, for the first time, the power of the Etruscans out of their long-continued and abundant prosperity. The victorious Romans proceeded to agree to a truce with the Etruscans. However, the truce was short-lived and was broken the following year. The war resumed, but this time the Etruscan power was truly not there anymore. The remaining Etruscan force was once again defeated by the Romans, who then marched deep into Etruria. The Roman army went all the way to the gates of Perusna, where they accepted the Perusnian surrender. In 304, Rome concluded the Second Samnite War with a victory, and now cemented their status as the most powerful state in central Italy. It was clear to the Etruscans that they could not match Rome on their own anymore. However, anti-Roman sentiment only grew in Etruria, and they would continue generally to ally themselves with the enemies of the Romans. In 299, the situation became even worse following the Roman establishment of colonies in Umbria. The Etruscans started preparing their forces, but were interrupted by the Gauls, who had themselves mobilized for yet another invasion from the north. The Etruscan cities were still wealthy and prosperous, and this time resorted to bribery. They attempted to bribe the Gauls to skip their territory and direct the invasion instead towards Rome. The Gauls accepted the payment, but refused to march against the Romans, and simply returned home. Upon hearing of this, the Romans dispatched an army to Etruria under consul Titus Manlius Torquatus. However, when Torquatus fell off his horse and died in a riding accident, the Etruscans interpreted it as a favorable sign for war. The Roman army still entered Etruria and devastated the countryside, but the Etruscans remained fortified inside their cities. Finally, in 298, word came to Rome from the Lucani in the south that the Samnites were devastating their land and that they sought help from Rome. This resulted in the Third Roman Samnite War, which once again divided the Roman force in two, one for the Etruscans and one for the Samnites. The Etruscans still largely avoided a pitched battle with the Romans, having only one inconclusive fight near Felatri before retreating back inside their walls. In 297, the Romans got word that the Etruscans were discussing suing for peace, and so decided to leave Etruria alone, now fully focusing on the Samnites. The very next year, in 296, the Samnites came to Etruria, insisting that the Etruscans join the war and that a broad coalition was necessary in order to defeat the Romans. The neighboring Umbrian tribes being willing to join the cause, nearly all the Etruscan cities voted for war. And just like that, hostilities with Rome were renewed once again. The notable exception was the Falisci, who restrained from another war, at least for a time. The first battle of the war did not go the Etruscan way. A large Roman army was dispatched to Etruria and defeated the Etruscans in a pitched battle. Luckily for the Etruscans, the Romans did not stick around to finish them off, but rushed back to the Samnite territory to reinforce their other army. The Etruscan cities spent the next year, 295, levying their forces and working on establishing a larger coalition. After securing the Umbrian and Samnite contingents, the Etruscan army was also joined by the Gauls, who reportedly made an invasion and then destroyed a Roman legion stationed at Cleusine. Subsequently, the combined allied force crossed the Apennine Mountains and marched towards the city of Sentinum. In order to counter this, the Romans ordered their legions, which were stationed near the Etruscan border, to advance into Etruria, and so forced the Etruscan and Umbrian armies to abort their march and return to fight off the invasion. The Battle of Sentinum thus took place between Rome on one side and the Senones and Samnites on the other, resulting in a hard-fought but decisive Roman victory. Meanwhile, in Etruria, the cities of Perusna and Cleusine were leading the Etruscan force. Soon enough, the Etruscans and Romans faced each other on the field of battle. Unfortunately for the Etruscans, it was the Roman legions that prevailed. Perusna still continued the war effort, and reportedly fought another battle against the Romans, but its army was yet again forced to withdraw and abort their campaign. In 293, the Romans turned to Samnium and went on to capture several Samnite cities. The Etruscans immediately used the opportunity to re-energize their war effort. They lured the Falisci to defect from Rome and join the Etruscan cause. This coalition was focused on defeating Roman allies in the area, until a consular Roman army was dispatched under Spurius Carvilius Maximus. Carvilius captured several towns in quick succession. The Falisci were forced to sue for peace. By 290, the Third Samnite War had finally come to a close, Rome achieving absolute victory, asserting its dominance, and annexing much of central Italy. The Etruscans were still independent and somewhat defiant, but really powerless to do anything to reverse the Roman gains. However, the shaky peace would not last for long. In 283, the Gallic Senones tribe invaded and besieged Aritim, now a firm member of the Roman alliance. A Roman force arrived under Praetor Lucius Caecilius Metellus Denter, but was defeated by the Gauls. Metellus lost his life in the process. The Romans did, however, ultimately manage to defeat the Senones after invading their territory with another army. This prompted the neighboring Boii to themselves enter war against Rome, and they mustered whatever allies they could find. It was at this point that the Etruscans, who had been expelled from the region by those same Gauls a century before, decided to step in and reinforce the Boii forces against the Romans. A battle took place at Lake Wadimo, the same location where the Romans had triumphed over the Etruscans 17 years prior. Appian reports that the Roman forces were led by Consul Publius Cornelius Dolabella. The outcome of the battle was once again the same, most of the Etruscan forces being destroyed, and only a few of the Boii escaping the rout. The defeated Etruscans clearly had no path to victory at this point, but their pride and their animosity towards Rome pushed them to carry on. It would all come to a conclusion the following year, however, when the remnants of the Etruscan army, allied with the Gauls, sallied out for one last battle against the Roman legions. While the location of the battle is not specified in the ancient sources, the outcome was inevitable. According to Polybius, the Etruscans and the Boii were utterly defeated, and it was only now that their courage at length gave way, and that they sent an embassy to sue for terms and made a treaty with the Romans. Etruria was finally defeated, and many of its city-states now made separate treaties with Rome, marking the end of the Etruscans as a significant power, as they now formally entered the Roman sphere of influence. Individual pockets of Etruscan resistance still continued for several years, particularly in the form of the Welk-Weltsna alliance, which still opposed Roman influence in the area. The two cities were defeated by Tiberius Coruncanius in 280. Welk was then stripped of its coastal possessions. Weltsna, on the other hand, fell into decay and internal unrest, and their ruling class was overthrown by the plebeians. Overall, Etruria was finally pacified, and although nominally independent, its cities were all put into an alliance with Rome, firmly under the Roman hegemony. This was observed by Pyrrhus, king of Epirus, who, upon his invasion of Italy in 280 BCE, counted on numerous cities and peoples rising up against the Romans and siding with him. But Pyrrhus immediately noticed that the Etruscans were not among those, as they stayed in the Roman camp. Ultimately, the Romans would go on to fight off Pyrrhus by 275, and subsequently subjugated the Hellenic cities to the south, becoming the masters of all Italy. The Etruscans now entered a period of gradual assimilation into Roman culture. Rome, by the time of the First Punic War in 264, annexing Etruria into the territory of the Republic. One of the last Roman interventions came in that same year, when the persecuted patrician class of Weltsna pleaded with Rome for help against the now ruling plebeians. A costly Roman intervention included the death of one of Rome's consuls, but also the ultimate destruction of the city and execution of the plebeian party leaders. The patricians, who had remained loyal to Rome, were subsequently settled in a new location nearby, a town called Volsini Novi. It continued to exist under Roman rule, but did not get to keep any level of sovereignty. Finally, it was during the First Punic War against Carthage that the last independent Etruscan settlement, the Corsican port city of Alalia, was transferred to the Romans. Rome went on to defeat the Carthaginians multiple times and ultimately became the greatest power of the age, the master of all the Mediterranean. The Etruscan cities continued to preserve their institutions for some time, and their history and civilization were highly respected in Rome. The 2nd century BCE records a Silat in Welk named Larth Tulumnes, who held the office no less than 8 times. Perhaps related, Setare Tulumnes was in turn elected Silat 3 times before the age of 25. Around the same time, Larth Lausisa held the Silatship in Kurtun, as recorded on Tabula Cortinensis. The Etruscan language would continue to be in use, although it was gradually overtaken by Latin. During the Social War of 91 to 87 BCE, the Etruscans opted to stay loyal to Rome and did not join the widespread Italian rebellion, resulting in the Etruscans officially becoming Roman citizens. Many Etruscans would go on to rise to leading positions in Roman politics. In addition to the old patrician families, dating back to the Monarchy and early Republic, numerous plebeian families of Etruscan origin came to prominence during the late Republican and Imperial Roman periods, including the positions of military commanders, governors, tribunes, senators, and even consuls. In the 1st century AD, the Emperor Claudius, whose wife was of Etruscan descent, composed a work of 20 books on the Etruscans called the Terharenica, a now lost study of their language and society. It is believed that the native Etruscan language finally became extinct by the end of that same century. However, their larger-than-life legacy continued to live on, deeply embedded in all spheres of Roman life and culture.